In the mid-1990s, America was obsessed with horror, but not the kind with monsters, ghosts, or supernatural killers. This was something different. In 1996, a movie called Scream hit theaters, and it didn't just become popular, it became a cultural event. It wasn't just watched by horror fans. Everyone saw it. Teenagers quoted it. Adults talked about it. It played in packed theaters, then moved into living rooms, sleepovers, and late-night rewatches. Scream changed how people thought about horror. Instead of treating killers as distant, terrifying figures, the film turned them into something else entirely. Normal people, high schoolers, friends, people who knew the rules of horror movies and joked about them while committing violence. The film was clever, self-aware, and darkly entertaining. And for most people, it stayed exactly that, entertainment. But for two teenage boys in Idaho, it became something more. Because while most viewers saw Scream as a movie, these two began to see it as a blueprint. Their names were Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. They were teenagers growing up in Pocatello, Idaho. Not isolated, not outsiders, not visibly troubled in a way that raised alarms. They went to school. They had friends. They blended in. And that detail matters, because this case isn't a story about two kids everyone already feared. It's a story about two kids people recognized. Two kids who can sit in class, laugh in the hallway, and look normal enough that nobody would assume what was building under. Privately, they were deeply immersed in horror culture, slasher movies, and violent fantasy. Over time, their conversations stopped sounding like fandom and started sounding like rehearsal. They didn't just talk about Scream, they talked about becoming it. They talked about what it would be like to step into the role, not as observers, but as the main characters. They talked about how horror villains were remembered, how victims weren't. In their minds, violence wasn't something distant or unimaginable. It was something dramatic, something meaningful, something that made you matter. Friends later said the way they spoke about killing felt unsettling. Not emotional, not angry, but strangely excited. As if they were discussing a concept instead of an act, as if real people were just placeholders in a story. At first, it stayed as talk. Then it became planning. They discussed weapons. They imagined scenarios. They talked about timing. They even filmed themselves discussing murder, videos later recovered by police that would become some of the most disturbing evidence in the case. And the fact that they filmed it matters, because it shows this wasn't a sudden snap. They weren't just mad one night. They treated it like a project, like something you prepare for, talk through, and build up to. In one recording, they talked about wanting to kill someone just to see what it felt like. Not because of anger, not because of revenge, because of curiosity. And slowly, the idea of killing stopped sounding extreme to them. The first real-world consequence came in September 2006, when they targeted Cassie Jo Stoddart. Cassie was a 16-year-old girl from Pocatello. She was kind, quiet, well-liked. And another detail people often miss, Cassie, Draper, and Adamczyk all went to the same school, Pocatello High School, and they were all 16-year-old juniors. So this wasn't a faceless victim picked from across town by strangers. This was someone from the same world, the same school system, the same small social orbit where everybody kind of knows everybody. She had no conflict with them, no argument, no history that would explain what happened. There was no personal motive. She wasn't chosen because of something she did. She was chosen because she was available. Cassie was house-sitting for relatives when Draper and Adamczyk went to her home. They had been there earlier in the day, acting normal, talking, laughing, blending in. That is one of the creepiest parts of this case. The normal version of them and the mask version of them existed on the same day. No buildup that Cassie could clearly see. Later that night, they returned. This time, they wore masks. They turned off the lights. They cut power to the house. They wanted fear first. Exactly like a horror movie. Cassie was alone inside when they attacked her. She was stabbed repeatedly. She tried to escape. She tried to fight back, but she didn't survive. Reports later described the attack as extreme. She was stabbed many times. And after it was over, the most chilling part is what they did next. They didn't run off in panic like people who just lost control. They went back into their normal world. School, friends, routine. Murder stunned the community. A teenage girl killed inside what should have been a safe home. But what disturbed investigators even more came afterward. When Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk were questioned, they didn't respond the way people expect killers to respond. There was no visible panic, no emotional breakdown. They spoke calmly, sometimes casually, often with a level of detachment that made experienced investigators uneasy. When asked why they did it, their answers didn't revolve around anger or revenge. They talked about curiosity, about wanting to experience it, about wanting to know what it felt like to kill someone. And again, Scream came up. They referenced horror movies openly. They compared themselves to slasher villains. They talked about murder not as something final and irreversible, but as something dramatic, something that happens to others. In their minds, they weren't villains. They were protagonists. What many people don't realize is that the violence didn't begin or end with Cassie. Before her murder, another woman had been attacked and survived. To be clear, in the evidence tied to this case, the big before and after isn't a confirmed earlier stabbing connected to them. It's the planning, the scouting, and the way the violence continued in their minds, even after the murder, through recordings and talk that treated it like a thrill instead of a human tragedy. When police began putting the pieces together, evidence piled up quickly. Video recordings surfaced, audio recordings surfaced, and these weren't vague rumors. These were their own words, their own footage, the kind of evidence that makes a case feel brutally. Recorded tape, where after the murder, they talk like they're reviewing what they just did, and it's hard to listen to because of how casual it sounds. In one recording made after the murder, one of the boys said they were so horny from killing, language that shocked even seasoned investigators. Not because it was emotional, but because it was casual. They didn't speak about guilt. They didn't speak about fear. They spoke about details. What happened, how it happened, what could have been done differently. It was as if they were reviewing a performance rather than reflecting on a crime. And then came another part of the case that's important for understanding how they got caught so fast. They weren't invisible criminal masterminds. They were teenagers who left trails, words, footage, behavior. The kind of trails that collapse a perfect plan in days. In fact, they were arrested just days after Cassie was killed. That's when the media stepped in. Headlines exploded with phrases like "Scream copycat killers." Talk shows debated whether movies could inspire violence. Parents worried. Schools reacted. The public wanted a clean explanation, something simple, something easy to blame. But investigators knew the truth was more uncomfortable. Scream didn't create violent thoughts out of nothing. What it did was provide a framework, a way to package violence as style, identity, and meaning. It made murder feel like a role someone could step into. And for two teenagers already drifting away from empathy and reality, that mattered. During the trial, testimony revealed just how deeply the two boys reinforced each other. Together, they normalized the idea of killing. Together, they stripped it of consequence. Psychologists testified that their dynamic fed off escalation, each validating the other's darkest thoughts. This is where the why becomes harder, because there isn't one clean answer. There's no single breakup, no single betrayal, no single moment where you can say, that's it, that's what caused it. What you see instead is a mix of things that can turn deadly when two people feed it together. Violent fantasy, craving for attention, and a warped idea that doing something extreme will make you important. They wanted the story. They wanted the role. And Cassie was the real person who paid for it. Both were convicted. Brian Draper was sentenced to life in prison. Tori Adamczyk was sentenced to life without parole. And they are still serving their sentences. Legally, the case was resolved. But culturally, it left behind something far more unsettling. This wasn't a story about a movie causing murder. It was a story about what happens when fiction replaces empathy. When people stop seeing others as human beings and start seeing them as characters. What made this case so disturbing wasn't the brutality alone. It was how ordinary the perpetrators appeared. Masks during the crime, normal teenagers the rest of the time. No cinematic ending, just two boys who decided reality could be treated like a script. And once that belief takes hold, violence stops feeling final. It starts feeling performative, rehearsable. And that's why this case still matters. Because the most dangerous idea isn't violence itself. It's the belief that violence can be experienced without consequence. That it's something you can step into and step out of, like a movie. Real life doesn't work that way. There are no retakes, no edits, no ending where the screen fades to black. Only victims. If you've made it this far, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and check out another interesting story.